We'll
Okay,
see.
we'll get it. Shall I start before the doors are closed then, or do you want to go outside and drag people in?
We're technically
It's
starting
11,
at
11,
11, so
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I would say in 30 seconds.
Okay,
Go ahead.
all right,
Run.
okay, good. Okay, good morning everybody. If you could kindly take your seats, we'll get started for our first panel. Good morning, my name is Julian Cox and I'm the founding curator of photography and chief curator at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. It's my pleasure to introduce this morning's panel on museums and civic responsibility, which brings together three distinguished colleagues that work at major metropolitan museums that serve large and diverse populations. Our presenters this morning are Robert Stein, Deputy Director of the Dallas Museum of Art, Jan Ludwig Gruters, Head of the Arts of Africa and the Americas and Curator of African Art at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, and Salvador Salord Pons, who is the Head of European Art Department and the Elizabeth and Alan Sheldon Curator of European Paintings at the Detroit Institute of Arts. The goal of this panel is to examine the roles that museums have within their communities, to ask how they function and how they are adapting to the ever-evolving needs of the communities and the public they serve. At the core of its mission, the Association of American Art Museum Curators seeks to promote inquiry, fellowship, and the exchange of ideas within the curatorial profession. As members of AAMC, we're all concerned about how the hot-button issues in our field impact curatorial practice. It's a given that we are committed to the personal enrichment of the visitors and the communities for whom we shape our collections, produce exhibitions, and provide public programs. We know that we play a part in helping to cultivate and support an educated, informed, and aware citizenry. Because of its relative informality compared to other cultural activities such as cinema, theatre, dance, and the symphony, museum going provides the opportunity for valuable social interaction. Focus groups and surveys tell us that visitors come to museums to learn things, of course, but we also know that they come first and foremost for social reasons. Fewer than 20% of visitors attend by themselves. The social agenda takes precedence, and the museum contributes to the creation of important new relationships. Museums also benefit from a high degree of public trust. They are among the few institutions in a community, along perhaps with libraries, that can function as a safety zone, an antidote to urban loneliness, where individuals can satisfy a basic need to be in the company of other people, a place where parents can enthusiastically send their children, or where members of a minority group can socialize without fear of intimidation. At the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, we currently have a photography exhibition on view that marks the 10th anniversary of the Iraq War. In conjunction with the show, we organized a public discussion that paired the photojournalists who made the images with two Iraqi refugees who are now resident in the Bay Area. Our education department worked diligently to create a safe environment for those refugees who had genuine concerns about speaking publicly to their experiences under occupation in Iraq and their lives as refugees in the United States. Ultimately, the event was a great success, but I was reminded that museums are indeed complex beasts. We want to inspire and edify, but we must also be useful and relevant to our public. In recent years, with the rapid evolution of the outwardly focused public service museum, the role of the curator has evolved dramatically. We now share our traditional authority over content with a range of other specialists, museum educators, public programmers, exhibition planners, and marketing and communications professionals. As this outward directed focus increases, typically a larger share of operating costs are diverted away from acquisitions and the study and care of collections. Significant changes are happening in the way that we conduct our business. The three presentations in this morning's session will, in different ways, shed light on the realities of our brave new world. Rob Stein will talk about his work at the Dallas Museum of Art, where he's been in post for little more than a year. Just a few months ago, as I'm sure you know, the museum announced a free admission and membership program called DMA Friends and Partners. We'll hear about the thinking behind it, how it has impacted the community, and how it may be changing the curatorial mission of the institution. More broadly, Rob will also share some thoughts on key issues in our field, such as civic engagement, access, and the role of digital media literacy. Jan Ludwig Curators has been working intently on audience engagement and community outreach concerns in his curatorial role at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. This morning he'll talk about two projects currently underway at his institution. The first is the reinstallation of the African Galleries, which is scheduled for fall 2013, and his plans for an ambitious exhibition of Islamic art and architecture in Africa, which is slated for 2016. Both projects have stimulated what for the MIA are new strategies for making the art more accessible and the museum more inviting. Salvador Salot Ponce will discuss the curatorial program at the Detroit Institute of Arts, which is built around maximizing the physical and intellectual comfort of visitors, helping them engage with the art on their own terms. This approach has gained added traction in the past year when the DIA secured a millage tax from 3 surrounding counties that will raise approximately $23 million for the institution over 10 years, and which in return provides free admission to the residents from those counties that pass the tax. Salvador will talk about the millage tax and its impact on his work, and he'll also describe the processes that the DIA employs to produce temporary exhibitions in keeping with its civic-minded mission. So to commence our program, please join me in welcoming Rob Stein of the Dallas Museum of Art. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to Holland for his comments this morning. I think they were really prescient in the sort of conversation that we're going to have this morning. If I could have my slides on the main screen, that would be great. So this morning we want to talk a little bit about museums and civic responsibility, and I hope that you will make good use of our question and answer time in the end. Let me make sure that this is going to go for me. Okay. Come on, clicker. Okay, so AV staff, all 4 buttons don't work. All right, very good. So the departure point from my talk this morning is the fact that, no, thank you. Okay. Is an assertion that, in fact, museums have a civic responsibility in the first place. And I think that admits a number of really interesting points. But to defend that point, which I'm not sure that I have to, if I can get this going. So museums are, all right. So I may just point at you to the booth to advance the slides for me, as I'm not certain that the clicker's working correctly. So all of us are working in museums as a public resource, as educational venues, next, as tax-exempt organizations, beneficiaries of charitable giving and federal support, and finally, as last point, thank you, collectors of cultural heritage. Next. Clearly, the museums that we work in are trusted, next. And according to a study at Indiana University, museums as historic resources of information are relied on or trusted more so than even grandparents, books, teachers. So Granny doesn't like this concept, but in fact, this is where we are. Next. But the question is, really, are we playing the sort of vital role in our communities that we would like to? Next, please. In 2010, the census reported that only 14.5% of U.S. adults had visited museums in the prior 12 months. Next. And in Dallas, a city of some 6.5 million people, which the Census Bureau said was growing faster than any other metropolitan area in the country, we have hovered around 10-year average attendance of 485,000, or right around 500,000. So that gives us a percentage of no better than 8%. So what if we talked about civic engagement instead? And this morning, rather than spending too much time focusing specifically on Dallas, I thought I would give you 3 points to think about in considering civic engagement in your own museums. The first is transformative access. The second is about embracing an emerging culture of participation. And the third is in seeking out public dialogue. Next, please. So we start as a departure point as early as 1948, when the United Nations began to assert human rights relative to cultural access. Next, please. And as recently as 2001 in this case, or 2006, UNESCO issued a declaration on cultural diversity that, among other things, asserts that cultural diversity is a key precondition for human rights with respect to culture, and that equal access to art is really a primary part of that. Next, please. So when we think about equal access to art and what that means in the context of museums, the question becomes a little more interesting. So we are, in fact, talking about the physical access to the building to view the art, but also the attitudinal and intellectual access that would allow a diverse community to equally partake in the art that we're offering. Next. Anna Marie Laaksonen of the International Federation of the Arts Councils talks about cultural participation in this way. She says, participation in cultural activities together with access to them forms the backbone of human rights pertaining to culture. Access is a precondition for participation, and participation is indispensable to ensure the exercising of human rights. And what we must admit is, if sitting in this room we feel that being exposed to that culture, having the access, being a part of museums in our communities does have a benefit that is tangible in the way that we think, the way that we respond to the creative activity of the history of culture, then those folks who do not have the same access that we do to that are experiencing a very real cultural gap. And in a society that's privileging more and more the information, innovation, and creativity culture, that culture gap is becoming a very real thing. So you've heard us talk a lot about the technology gap, the economic, racial, or gender gaps, and I think we need to consider what a similar culture gap may be if we do not focus as heavily as we should on equal access to our collections. So Mark O'Neill, in a paper called The Good Enough Visitor in Museum Society Inequality in 2002, said, if social inclusion means anything, it means actively seeking out and removing barriers, acknowledging that people who have been left out for generations need additional support in a whole variety of ways to enable them to exercise their rights to participate in many of the facilities that the better off and better educated take for granted. And as a member of the better off and better educated, I have a harder time relating to that than I should, but it doesn't excuse me from the responsibility for making that happen. I think if we talk about civic responsibility, and the comment was made in the questions earlier, this is not just the role of a museum educator or a visitor engagement staff or even the curatorial staff, it's the museum's responsibility. And so as we're thinking about that in Dallas, hey, thank you, Clicker. We're making a few different moves and changes, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about that in detail. But in January this year, we made a move to drop our admission prices, which had been at $10 for approximately a decade, to free general admission. And more than that, as we realized that we were drawing audiences who heretofore had not been a part of the museum. Dallas is much like any other metropolitan area, somewhat segregated between the class that sees themselves as consumers of the arts and other classes that do not. So when you're new to the first time to an art museum and the first question you get when you walk in the door is, are you a member? That can be off-putting. And so instead we are trying to flip the concept of membership on its head and talk more about participation as a currency of membership. that instead of paying money to become a member, you are a member by how you demonstrate your affiliation and contribution to the museum's community. I'm excited to say that in continuing to reach out, the museum this summer will host a naturalization ceremony for new citizens to the United States in the Art Museum. And we're actively talking right now about what is it that we could do to make those new citizens feel welcome and an important part of Dallas, and the fact that the museum wants them to feel as though this is their museum. So stay tuned for that. So we've had some good response from many of you, but also around the country, and Jason Farrago in The Guardian said it better than I can in terms of what we're really trying to do inside of Dallas as a city. Jason says when you can slip into a gallery for just 15 minutes to see a favorite painting, or where parents can take their children without having to budget for it, the museum takes on a societal function. It's no longer just a fortress or an amusement, it's a civic platform where education and citizenship go hand in hand. For Dallas, a museum membership should be like a library card. Everyone should have one. And it should foster an engagement with the museum that goes beyond the occasional visit to a kind of civic pride. I hope it works, because in a perpetually privatizing world, the kind of civic culture that the Dallas Museum of Art is trying to foster has become rarer than any antiquity. We are this week set to cross a barrier of about 10,000 individuals who call them now friends of the DMA. We had a historic museum membership of about 22,000 households. So to cross 10,000 in little more than a few months is really quite interesting. Not only that, but we know how those 10,000 individuals are engaging with us and participating, because they tell us. I think none of you are strangers to the anecdotes that we hear in our galleries about wonderful experiences that are being had with works of art. We've just never had the ability to count, track, record it. The best we've done in the past of gauging our impact is the occasional survey and attendance counts at the door. So how can we do better than that? Henry Jenkins, a media theorist and critic, originally at MIT, now at the Annenberg School and at USC, describes an emerging participatory culture that has really transformed our society and the way that we think about art and the way that we consume information. He describes the participatory culture as one with relatively low barriers to artistic expression and civic engagement. Notably, he says that this culture features a type of informal mentorship, whereby what is known by the most experienced is passed along to novices, where individual members believe that their contributions matter and feel some degree of social connection to each other. He's recognizing that this culture is emerging as we witness an explosion of new media online and information online, and that it is possible for average consumers to do the tasks that we in museums have done for decades: the archival, annotation, appropriation, and recirculation of media content. So that transformation, as it's happened, has meant some very subtle things that are affecting the way that museums exist inside of this culture that's changing around us. This graphic, which I think you can see here, is an earlier one which takes the opportunity to try a visual representation of the scope and scale of the internet. I'm not sure that it does a very good job, but it's undeniable that we are in the midst of an information explosion, and the problem with that is that while discrete sources of online information are growing incredibly rapidly, it's never been more difficult to discriminate actual quality among those sources. And this is a skill that, by and large, our schools are not teaching. It has changed so rapidly that adults in our cities do not have a grasp of this. And in museums, we rarely talk about what could be described as a real form of literacy, but digital media literacy. And Henry Jenkins writes very eloquently about this, but the literacy of information in the information age is a true form of literacy and the nuances of understanding and putting that to use and discriminating quality from lack of quality are a skill that we're not really up to speed on. It strikes me that museums are a really perfect place to do this, as we've collected all forms of media and mediums for decades, and for many of us over 100 years. There are opportunities in looking at the aesthetic creations of artists and the insights that they encode into their works of art that can help our publics to understand new forms of media and expression that are present on the internet. Museum scholars are experts at how communication happens in a variety of different forms through creative media, and this is more and more what we're seeing online. Lastly, it's hard to pass up that slide. But, lastly, I think a critical opportunity in engaging our civic publics is in seeking out public dialogue. And this is sometimes a scary topic. Museums have made a business on trading on the authority of their information. And as Jenkins talks, that this ability to create, remix, annotate, and archive the information that we're collecting is now in the hands of the masses. And many of us, myself included, are creating media at a rate that has never been possible before. This dialogue is the hallmark of an engaged organization. And what we're seeing is that authority question is really not so much one that is about a loss of control, but if we break that word down a little bit more and think about the kind of authority that we're after, I think most in the room would agree we're not really eager to be the authoritarian source of information, but the authoritative source of information. And the difference is one is taken and one is given. And the public, or our engagement with the public in dialogue, in an open discussion and debate, allows them to give us the authority based on the expertise and research that's been done over a long period of time. The Americans for the Arts wrote a really interesting white paper in the Museum and Community Toolkit from the AAM called Giving Voice: A Role for Museums in Civic Dialogue. And they say that there is a growing movement to reinvigorate civic dialogue as a vital dimension of a healthy democracy, based on the premise that a democracy is animated by an informed public engaged in the issues affecting their daily lives. Civic dialogue plays an essential role in this process, giving voice to multiple perspectives and enabling people to develop more multifaceted, humane, and realistic views of complex issues and of each other. Yet opportunities for civic dialogue in this country have diminished in recent years, due mainly to the polarization of opinion along ideological, racial, gender, and class lines, social structures that separate the rich from the poor and majorities from minorities, a sense of individual disempowerment, and the overwhelming nature of many of society's problems. Perhaps most fundamentally, the fact that modern problems usually affect different people in different ways often places them outside of the traditional civic organizations as labor unions and political parties that organized discourse in the past. The article goes on to assert that museums are the perfect place for this to happen, and I would agree. I think that there are few places left in society where all stripes of our communities can come and have an honest conversation on a neutral playing field about topics that matter and have mattered over the course of history. It is a key opportunity for us and one that we have still not yet figured out. I think it's true that the civic function of museums is an interesting question, perhaps more so and perhaps the defining question for museums in the next decade. What is the function? What does the museum do in the community? Stephen Weil writes about making museums matter, and he says that the reason for a museum to exist must be more than simply that it does, but it must matter in some way to the community for which it serves. It's true that the function of our museums will have many different facets, and discovering exactly which ones we're good at remains a task for the reader. So thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you for having me on this panel. My name is Jan Lodewijk Curators, and I'm the curator of African art at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. And I was very excited that we heard so much about African art this morning from Mr. Cotter. I will talk about audience engagement and development at the MIA, especially in the field of African art. And across the board, museums are trying to reinvent themselves away from the classic model of omniscient content delivery, what Rob just talked about, this authoritarian voice, to a more participatory model of two-way social engagement, this participatory culture that Jenkins talks about. Now, it must be clear that the motivation for this is in part pragmatic, because a museum, certainly for major metropolitan museums, visitor numbers are dwindling or remaining constant at best. And so new segments of the population, new audiences must be tapped. Segments of the population for whom traditionally the museum is not a natural place to dwell. But at the same time, the paradigm shift is also inspired by, first of all, new interactive technologies, which make this two-way social engagement much more easy and logical. And secondly, a more self-reflective trend in museology, questioning what one is doing and what one can do. In 2012, the Minneapolis Institute of Arts developed a strategic plan for the next 4 years, and the plan emphasizes, among other things, audience engagement, thereby recognizing that the museum's audiences, in plural, are becoming more and more globally diverse and also technology savvy. And so the African Art Department at the MIA has been developing audience engagement for several years, and I will present two of its projects here. One is about to come to completion. That's the reinstallation of the African galleries, scheduled to open in the fall, in November of 2013. And the other project is at its early stages. It's the organization of a comprehensive exhibition on Islamic art and architecture in Africa, which is scheduled for the spring of 2016. Both projects have been funded or are being funded by the NIH. When I arrived at the MIA about 5 years ago, and my first major task was to reinstall the galleries. The MIA had never had an Africanist. I organized a small experimental exhibition called I Africa. Not like in I Claudius, but with a small I, like an iPad or iPod, which tested different kinds of didactics. It also developed an interactive app to play a musical instrument, a lamellophone, better known as a thumb piano. And it experimented with various kinds of display, also allowing visitors to experience sound, smell, and touch. And there was a survey of that, of the reactions of the experiences. And that led to also a number of focus groups. One of the major focus groups which had to compare this iAfrica exhibition with the traditional galleries, which in the meantime have closed down. And one of the conclusions, a little frustrating, of these focus groups was that people liked equally the new and the old. So that was good to know, but hard to work with. But we then organized a number of what we called open house conversations. These were 2 to 3 hour sessions where 3 target groups were addressed, one after the other. The first group was museum guides and docents, who of course have both a knowledge of the art and of the public, the audiences. We had a second open house conversation for comments and feedback on the reinstallation, on the plans of the reinstallation with Twin Cities teachers, because the museum is, of course, a major tool for schools. And then third group was community members, both African American community and recent African immigrants in the Twin Cities. We have a very large community of Somali people in the Twin Cities, also from Ethiopia and some Western African countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone. And so I can give you some examples of the things that came out of these conversations. One was the emphasis on oral history and oral literature, how to combine that with visual arts, since it's such an important art form in Africa. Proverbs, poetry, and so it's still something that we are trying to solve, to grapple with, how to integrate that in the new galleries. People liked the idea of interactive technologies, about which I will say a little more in a minute, but also emphasized the digital divide. In other words, the necessity to keep traditional labels that one can read or not read. The toughest problem, probably, or the most contentious, was the integration of contemporary art in the new African art galleries. And I was very interested in the experiment of Samuel Sidibe at the Museum of Bamako to make his display of antiquities and traditional art more relevant to a contemporary Malian or urban public. And for contemporary art in African art or diaspora art at the MIA, there were really two very opposite opinions. Some expressed the importance to show this as proof that the African continent still produces art, that it's not frozen in time, not static, and that younger people would connect, people of the hip-hop generation, interested in African fashion, etc. But then there was also a group that emphasized the break between so-called traditional art, spiritual art, and contemporary art, which is mainly Western, for Western sensibilities. And so you can't have both, so we have to choose, of course, and we will incorporate contemporary art in the new galleries, but we will try to make clear where the differences lie between that art and the more traditional religious art. Then there was the emphasis on the necessity to have multiple voices in the labels, which can also be a nightmare for the curator, but which is very important to attend to. So these are a few examples that came out of these open house conversations and that have informed further experiments and also the actual reinstallation. For instance, at the end of last year, since both mediums, the traditional labels and the new technology, interactive technology, will be integrated in the new galleries, we had a project called This Label Needs You, which we installed in 2 places or 3 places of the existing galleries, where people were invited to read a label, look at the object, and comment upon the label or come up with questions or free associations. And for instance, one of the objects we had chosen was a power figure from Congo, traditionally known as a nail fetish, but that's a very taboo word, so we don't use it anymore. But I think you may have seen them. These are wooden sculptures in which pieces of metal have been nailed. And so people had all kinds of associations with Vodun, with pain, suffering, all of which are irrelevant to the Congo culture. So that certainly informed the way that we are rewriting that particular label. And then we had interactive technology tested in the galleries. We have various touch screens that provide layers of information including, for instance, for royal Benin art from Nigeria, including information about how that art came to the West. And some of you may know the history, but in 1897, the British organized a military punitive expedition against the king of Benin, Benin City, which, as I said, is in current state of Nigeria. And the palace was sacked and looted, and tons of art were shipped to Britain, where the British Museum made the first pick, and then the rest was sold to other European museums and private collectors. And so the MIA has some Benin royal art, and we have an interview with a Nigerian art historian who explains what the significance of that art would be for Nigeria. Out of the open house conversations, we created a smaller group of community advisors, a core of 6 people who met a few times with the architects. The redesign is being led by an architect's firm, and there was very interesting feedback, for instance, on the colors that the architects had chosen, which were deemed far too cold and uninviting. So we are changing the color scheme of the African gallery so that people whose art is being shown feel welcome in the galleries. That's the main point. Then I wanted to say a few words about the other project and how we try to involve the various audiences, the Islamic Africa show foreseen for 2016. And of course, everything that Mr. Cotter said about art in the context of life and of showing a living religion is very pertinent here. As I said, the Twin Cities have a very large Somali population who, of course, is Muslim. And we will be organized, we are in the planning phase of that exhibition now. We will be organizing a round table in January of next year with local stakeholders, including imams and other people who are Muslim from the Twin Cities, and then also Africanist and non-Africanist Islamic scholars and curators to kind of address a number of issues and questions, some of which I can come up with now, but some of which will develop during the roundtable. For instance, the issue of so-called image prohibition in Islamic art, which is a very complex story. How to respectfully display religious items that are being used today. And for instance, a smaller detail like the necessity or not to include dates from the Muslim calendar on the labels. As you know, the Muslim calendar starts in 622 CE, current era, and it's the Hijri calendar, and most Muslims, of course, identify with that particular way of counting time. And an important component of the Islamic exhibition is also an online exhibition that is called Digital Diaspora, Reuniting the Arts of Islamic Somalia. And that's a project, it's a bilingual virtual exhibition that will be developed with Somali high school students in Twin Cities, and who will be working with pictures of Somali objects that have been scattered throughout the world in various museums, and will take these pictures or some of these to their parents or grandparents and then interview them to get information. Often the pupils themselves who have been born in the US probably have never seen these objects, and then kind of co-curate an exhibition that will be shown at the same time as the actual exhibition in the gallery, and which will be online. So I will end here emphasizing that with African art, there's kind of as I see it, a dual challenge in the sense, in terms of audience engagement and development. On the one hand, there is the traditional museum goer, the Western white person over 55 or 60, I think the statistics says, who in general has very little, who's unfamiliar with African art and has therefore possibly less interest in African art. And so how to make that art more accessible to a museum-going public. And on the other hand, there is the African art that is shown with members from various African communities that live in the same city, but who do not feel invited or welcome at the museum. So the museum has to be made more accessible for those new communities. Thank you.
Good morning, my name is Salvador Salor Pons, and I'm the head of the European Art Department at the Detroit Institute of Arts. I'm grateful to Sally and Julian for having me in this panel today. My presentation deals with my personal experience working at the DIA as a European curator, working in a museum at the DIA that is now considered a visitor center museum. In November 2007, the DIA opened to the public its renovated building and presented this new installation. The entire effort was called the New DIA. It was the result of the work that took several years. The architect, Michael Graves, projected the building expansion, and teams of educators, curators, conservators, and other specialists conceived a new installation of the entire collection, which is one of the finest collections in America. As Director Graham Bill pointed out to me recently, the reinstallation focused primarily on conveying the power of art, more than on the whole notion of the total museum experience. To convey the power of art and to boost the variety of meanings that our objects produce in our visitors, the DIA decided to install its collections not using a traditional art historical criteria. Instead, the galleries were conceived thematically as if they were the subjects of temporary exhibitions in which the objects were presented in the context of specific stories. To determine those stories, the DIA teams had brainstormed a large number of possible themes that came naturally from the collections. Later on, we shared some of those themes with members of the community grouped in visitor panels. Our intention was to gather some feedback and see which of those stories would be of general interest or compelling to them. To a certain degree, the DIA visitors or the real audience helped the DIA decide what stories to tell in the galleries. The reinstallation did not break totally with the former DIA art historical installation. The museum kept the DIA's traditional approach of presenting its collection the way director William Valentiner established in 1927. That is, art is displayed not by typology, but by culture and era. Therefore, paintings, sculpture, and decorative arts all share the same galleries. This allowed for the exploration of who, how, where, and when those objects were made. To these four interrogatives, the DIA new installation added a new one, the why. Why were they made? The answering of this question gave the opportunity to present the objects, focusing, for example, on their utilitarian value, something that a visitor with any kind of background could relate to. As a matter of fact, to understand the stories that we tell at the DIA with our collection, the visitor does not need any sort of art historical background. We tell stories that they can relate to and are based in a shared human experience. But more importantly, those stories encourage them to look at the art. In 2008, the DIA changed its mission statement. The 2002 mission statement that you can see on the slide, to serve the public through the collection, conservation, exhibition, and interpretation of the art of a broad range of cultures and so on, was, was very much simplified and reformulated into our current one, creating experiences that help each visitor find personal meaning in art. The 2008 mission statement strongly focuses on the response of DIA visitors, rather than in the traditional focus on preservation, study, and exhibition of the art collection. This approach brings the concept of the visitor-centered museum, which is, according to some, a museum where all aspects of the institution's operations are prioritized and designed to foster the physical and intellectual comfort of the general visitor, creating an environment that helps individuals engage with the art on their own terms. As a European, with a European background and experience in European museums, the DIA mission statement and the new installation was something I have never encountered. The DIA had hired me in February 2008. Therefore, I had not been involved in the new installation, and I was not fully aware of the museum's shift in institutional approach from the art collection focus to its visitor focus until the DIA's new mission statement was announced in 2008 in a staff meeting. While I was not part of the reinstallation, during the 5 years I have been working at the DIA, I had been involved in the organization of temporary exhibitions. For this exhibition, the DIA uses a very similar, if not the same, interpretative approach as the one employed in the new permanent galleries. Thus, my work as a DIA curator in the exhibitions I have curated, as well as in my daily curatorial activities related to the permanent galleries and collection, have been determined by DIA's new mission statement. The new DIA mission statement has impacted not only the work of the curatorial division, but also other departments in the museum. Furthermore, with this new DIA mission, the Learning and Interpretation Division plays a very important role in the institution, a new role. In fact, the DIA's vision of art interpretation and presentation in the galleries has become a central focus of the museum's activity. It is innovative in many ways and has become a DIA's trademark. As in many other museums, one of the main aspects or strategic goals of the curatorial division is creating and helping organize temporary exhibitions. In a simplified effort to summarize the exhibition process in any given museum, one can say that traditionally the curator proposes the exhibition idea, and once it is approved by, let's say, the director and the chief curator, prepares a checklist, negotiates and secures the loans, lays out the works in the gallery plans according to the curator's expertise, works with the designer in this task, prepares the labels and gallery panels, adjusting the text with publishing department, and finally informs the educators of the scope and content of the show. During this process, the curator has been also preparing the exhibition catalog with specialized colleagues and a scientific committee. The curator is the leader of all aspects of the show and shares with the different departments, education, marketing, publication, development, and so on, all the relevant information related to it. With the new DIA approach, exhibitions are planned in a different fashion. Initially, the curator proposes an exhibition and presents it to the so-called Steering Interpretive Team, SIT. This team includes the chief curator, the director, the deputy director, and the director of education, who chairs it. Once the project is approved, the education department assigns an educator to work with the curator on the project. The curator then explains the idea of the show and provides the checklist to the educator. Then the educator, together with the curator, creates what is called the big idea. The big idea or storyline is a statement that includes a subject, an active verb, and a consequential statement that is relevant to a general audience. It will be the ruling principle of the show, and the works of art included in it have been chosen, arranged, and interpreted to support it. Once the big idea is set and agreed between the educator and the curator, the team establishes the visitor outcomes. These outcomes are what we expect the visitors will take away from the exhibition. They can be satisfaction outcomes, learning outcomes, and so on. These outcomes are directly related to the DIA mission, understood as a visitor-centered museum. With the big idea and the visitor outcomes, the team, educator and curator, prepares the layout of the show and establishes the interpretation plan and work schedule. Then the team works on the gallery panels and object labels. While working on this text, the educator, with the help of the curator, goes out in the community and shares some of the ideas that the exhibition will cover. The goal is to look for feedback and create some preliminary dialogue with our visitors to see how effective we are getting our ideas across. The gallery panels and labels at the DIA follow specific guidelines in terms of length, language, content, format, and are mostly written by the educators with the collaboration of the curator. The curator's main role in the label production is to provide the content and supervise its accuracy in the label. Before sending the text to our publication department, a good number of them, labels and panels, are tested in the galleries with mock-ups of the works of art that will be in the show. Our evaluation department conducts this test, and their goal is to identify concepts that are potentially difficult to understand for our visitors, as well as other areas of improvement. This evaluation work is extremely useful and can have a strong influence in the presentation of the artwork and the content selection for the label. Once the texts are ready, the editor works on them. The design of the exhibition is oriented to enhance the visitor experience, and therefore, the educator works closely with the designer in collaboration with the curator. In this stage, the distribution of the interpretive devices, pull-up panels, installation interpretive tools, and other devices is important. During the installation, the educator and the curator work together in the gallery floors. The curator supervises the hanging of the objects that need to be installed following the DIA standards. This is at 60 inches from the floor. We hang low to encourage close observation. The educator places the label and gallery panels and supervises the installation of other educational devices that are spread throughout the galleries. Finally, when the show opens to the press, the curator and the educator address the journalists. This is a much reduced version of the process that we follow to prepare exhibitions. The main change in the curator exhibition work is that from now on, the exhibition concept, scope, and presentation are discussed in teams from the early conception of the project. The educators lead some aspects of the project and the curator others. The curator does not have the exclusive pivotal role it used to have. The role is now shared with the educator. The processes to prepare exhibitions are conceived in a way that curators and educators collaborate in productive fashion. Curators and educators have traditionally different goals. The curator focuses on the objects and the relationship in order to clarify scientific aspects that will shed light for better understanding of our history. The educator, on the other hand, focuses on the visitor experience and how the objects in the show can be arranged and interpreted to provide personal meaning to the visitors of all backgrounds. There is some resistance between the educators and the curators' goals that is tangible in the team meetings. However, this mild tension is generally softened by the exhibition outcomes that have been agreed in the early stages of the project. In my opinion, it is a positive tension from which the teams can create displays that fulfill most of the goals of both curators and educators. While it's not an easy process, the DI has demonstrated that we can organize sophisticated exhibitions in terms of our history and present them in a way that is meaningful and engaging to all or most of our visitors. In my experience, examples of these fruitful and creative tensions have been the shows Fakes, Forgeries, and Mysteries, most recently Rembrandt and the Face of Jesus, and many others. While the DI organizes successful exhibitions, the process of executing them is not an easy one and has a direct impact on the curator's work. One can see in the slide the interpretive planning for exhibitions and gallery chart. it is not a straightforward one. And there are some challenges that curators and educators are working on solving. One of the challenges of our exhibition processes is the time it takes to work on the interpretation plan. It normally takes 18 months. This is a lengthy and intense process in which, for example, the preparation of the exhibition catalog is not included. It's important to remember that while doing exhibition, curators work on many other tasks related to their jobs beyond the exhibitions themselves. Another challenge in the process, it is to understand the leadership role of curators and educators at the different stages of the process. These roles are not well defined yet. There is a final challenge, which is the perception that there is a shift in leadership from the curator to the educator. One can imagine that the word in the curatorial division is that the curator has been disempowered. This perception is understandable, but not necessarily true. The DIA is committed to doing engaging shows where the visitor experience is important, but the scholarly layer plays a relevant part as well. To this regard, it's important to remember that the curator provides the concept of the show and the art historical information from the very beginning. These two factors are quite powerful and strongly determine many aspects of any given exhibition. As I mentioned at the beginning, the DI installed this permanent collection using a set of themes that resemble temporary exhibitions. This layout and the way the art objects have been interpreted in the galleries has been a tremendous success with our public. Tangible proof of this success is the fact that the 3 local counties voted in favor of a property tax or millage tax last summer to support the DIA operations. This is a remarkable milestone, especially with the very difficult Detroit economy, which will help the DIA continue to operate for the next 10 years and builds its endowment for operations. In this regard, I think one can be pretty sure that the transformation of the DIA as a visitor-centered museum since 2008 has hugely helped the success of the millage. The visitor came to the DIA, liked it, and finally voted for it. In exchange for their support, they will receive free admission and special programs. We know that in the future, the DIA will strengthen its visitor-centered approach. We also know that the DIA will be strongly focusing on our art interpretation work. There are many challenges and questions on the table. For example, should curators acquire art that serve a purpose in the current installation of the permanent thematic galleries? Or should we continue purchasing or acquiring art because it's important for the collection as a whole? Also, should the educators be involved in art acquisitions? These questions and many others are difficult to answer. What seems clear to me is that the DIA, the work of curators and educators, will be closely related in the near future, and that both will play an equal role in the success of art interpretation and display. Thank you very much.
Two audience mics up, please. Thank you. Just to start things off, I'd like to say that obviously we focused in the 3 presentations this morning on large metropolitan museums, but I'm aware, for example, that university art museums as one kind of institution has not really been represented, and they, of course, have to serve their academic communities, but also have important public roles too, and are very relevant to this discussion. So in the Q&A portion, it'd be great if we could hear from staff who are involved in university and college art museums, because I think that's key to the discussion. Rob, perhaps I could start with you by just asking you to tell us a little bit more about how the DMA program has gone in the sort of 4 or 5 months since it's been open. You mentioned something like 10,000 registered members as a consequence, but what kind of feedback have you been getting from them about the new program in general?
Sure, thank you. So we announced the program in the fall and launched for the first time on the 21st of January. That was the same day when the museum returned to a free general admission model. At the same time, the DMA Friends program is this free membership and participation program for the public, and a similar parallel program called DMA Partners focuses on philanthropic giving in a membership model that extends from what we had done in the past. We've had really good response from our community on both sides. We've seen kind of the philanthropic giving quicken, and the sizes of average gifts are increasing. And the reaction in social media and the press has been quite good, with a lot of our supporters really favoring broad access for the community, and a lot of families really coming for the first time. That's unique because the DMA is one museum that has placed an extraordinary amount of effort on community engagement and outreach over the years, and has been very successful in that, in my estimation. So to have it be that this program enhances even that achievement is pretty good. We have some guests who are coming and participating in our Friends program who in this short period of time have returned to the museum 30, 40, or 50 times individually. And so now we can know for the first time their name, who they are, when they come, what they do when they arrive. And so we're trying to then figure out about 15% of those roughly approaching 10,000 friends have already returned to visit the museum. So for the 85% who have been once, what is it that we do to draw them back over and over again?
Can you say anything about how the new program has affected curatorial mission? Is it still too early to know? But presumably if the program was launched, you had to have thought about how it might change what you do programmatically. Can you say a few things about that?
Sure. It is certainly still a work in progress, and one where, as a staff, we're figuring it out together. The curatorial program is going apace in the way that it has, and in fact, it wasn't a complete reshaping of the program efforts of the museum. In reality, it was a repackaging in a way that we could learn about the activities that the visitors are doing. So we're not pretending that there is no engagement happening in the museum. In fact, we know that engagement happens. We just have a hard time measuring it or recording it. And so together with the curatorial staff and educators, really a broad team weekly gathers and looks at what are the visitors actually doing and what are moves that we can make to serve that better. I think we have seen that simply by packaging the offer of the museum differently and revealing it in some different ways, we've seen increased traffic into the permanent collections in places that were a little surprising to us. And that is really, not requiring a lot of change in the interpretive strategy yet. I think it will imply that in the future, but we're really trying to step into it as a group together and learn along the way.
And then you mentioned philanthropic activity. I mean, how has that broken down thus far? I mean, there's obviously there are foundation support, individuals and corporations. I mean, have you seen an increase in giving that's been dramatic in the last 4 to 5 months?
It's still coming.
Yeah.
When we were making the plans to return to free admission, we of course looked at the business model of the museum, and in studying it, the box office for general admission accounted for about 2.5% of the overall revenues of the museum, and kind of the lower levels of membership, for which we were making them free, accounted for another 2.5%. So the question to the board was really, did they feel as though going to this model of free admission and free membership would make the museum 5% more relevant to its communities? As we surveyed our membership and our philanthropic supporters, the membership fell into two camps. Largely one camp that was interested in a bargain of membership as a way to spend less money over the course of a year, and the other camp that was by and large the actual real revenue support of the museum was for philanthropic purposes. So if you were going to place a bet on art museums as philanthropic entities, we feel like this sort of approach to access gives us a better case for support.
And how about for you, Salvador? You mentioned the significant shift in Detroit with the program that you sort of broke down very carefully for us. How has that, given how these three counties responded and they passed the vote, how has that, have you been able to attract more corporate support or other kinds of support for the museum as a result of this new shift?
I think so. The museum now is a winner, and everybody wants to stick with winners. And we've been having a lot of support from different corporations, and we have the big goal now to raise, we have 10 years now of support from the counties with which we can, that support covers our operations, but basically that is giving us time to build our endowment. And our focus now is not to raise every year 25 million to survive. Our focus now is to raise 400 million in 10 years to secure the financial future of the museum.
And for you, Jan, at Minneapolis, you also have a similar millage tax in effect, isn't that correct?
Yes, there's in Minnesota voted a small increase on taxes to protect the environment and stimulate culture.
And that provides a certain amount of income for your institution every year.
Yes.
Right, great.
And the museum being on park ground, the founders of the museum at the beginning of the 20th century came up with a formula that the Park Board of Minnesota also supports the museum financially.
Great. Yeah. Can we have any questions from the floor now? Might be a good time to open up. We have mics on either side, if you don't mind coming to the mic, because we'd like to record the questions for the record. So we've got someone coming over here. Please line up, thank you. Yes, Paul.
I didn't particularly want a question. I wanted to simply inform that in Mobile, where we have 75% city support, recently we invited all city employees to become members. And they responded, and actually some increased their level because it was a basic membership. They responded with end-of-year gifts and upping their level of the status of the membership. The Mobile Museum of History also did the same with the same result. So we were being more welcoming and we were responded to.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Vicki Wright from the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts. I was enthralled by all of the wonderful things that you've spoken about that are internal and structural changes that you've made. You still have to get people to come to your institution, so I'm curious to have you, one or more of you, speak about how this has affected your marketing techniques and and the ways that you get people to come to your institutions.
Yeah, I'd be happy to start. Dallas has not been very different than most of the rest of us in its marketing approach over the past few years, in that we are, it's incumbent upon us to begin a shift away from large traditional paid media. Television is certainly out of our price range. Radio is becoming out of our price range. In Dallas, as a driving city, even billboard marketing results are not really performing in the way that we would hope they would. This is somewhat of a big net problem where you're trying to catch all of the fish with the same net. As a shift that we're hoping to equate with this move to a DMA friend model, is one of individualized or very niche targeted marketing efforts where it's not as much marketing in the traditional sense as it is mapping interest and community, knowing which areas of the city are actually participating and which are lagging. So for the first time, we know on a weekly, even daily basis, which zip codes in the city are showing up or not showing up. That may in fact drive some of that large net marketing approach. So why not, we have a goal in our strategic plan of the physical audience of the museum matching the physical demographics of the metropolitan area. So if we know that there are zip codes for which we're not drawing a commensurate number of visitors, why not advertise heavily in those areas and rely on then targeted or niche marketing efforts for the audiences that are coming mapped against what they're actually doing in the museum.
Is that just is the data set the 10,000 new members, or is it a larger data set than that you're drawing from?
It is 10,000 new members generating, some millions of sort of activities already, but also any sort of survey, qualitative survey data that I know that Detroit and Minneapolis both do quite a lot of, merging those two together to really get a picture of what the audiences are doing or responding to more or less successfully.
Salvador, any answer to that question, response about the marketing side of things?
Well, it's of course still work in progress, these two projects, but marketing is indeed, will focus on schools, for instance, where there are a lot of mixed schools that have large populations of Somali students. And it's clear that already in the planning phase of the Islamic Africa show, contacts have become more easy because of the involvement during the reinstallation project. So there is a payoff, but I have no idea how it will affect the numbers of visitors.
And the DI after the successful millage has been a huge increase in attendance. Now the museum is packed, and especially our Fridays where we have all these programmings going on. The museum is much more than a museum. It's really a place to gather. As a European, I always compare the DI with the role that a square in the middle of the city does in a city like Madrid or Rome. Everybody goes to the square on Friday night to meet with their friends. I think Detroit has their public square in the DIA, and it's been wonderful. Our marketing department basically works towards temporary exhibitions, how to explore what kind of audiences we have and how to present those exhibitions to them.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I had a question for Jan Ludwig, but I'm looking forward to everyone answering, and that has to do with working with community groups during the planning stages of a project or an installation. And I'm wondering if you have plans or you think through how you will keep those community members involved way beyond the opening and through the years.
Yes, that's very much to the point. And one of the things that came out of these open house conversations was the request to keep this conversation going and to remain flexible and to be able to do changes and adjustments. So that's certainly something that will continue.
Maybe one from this side. Did you have anything else? Maybe one from this side, yeah.
Hello, I'm Julie Perotti from the Dixon in Memphis. I had a question for Salvador about, I thought your idea of testing labels before an exhibition was really interesting. And I guess I'm just wondering kind of from a practical standpoint how that works and what your time frame is for putting that together. How far in advance of the exhibition do you do that? And I guess also I'm wondering how is the feedback submitted and how is that all formulated into the final label that goes on the wall?
We have an evaluation department that leads this process. Generally, if I will remember, it's 3 months before we submit our labels to the publication department. And what they do, it's really fascinating because they take our labels and with mock-ups and they go into the galleries and random visitors come and they just ask them what they think with a questionnaire. Then once they have gathered all the information, we, the curator and the educator and the evaluator, we meet and they tell us what things are working, what things aren't, and it could be labels, panels, and even the entire installation. If we are actually making our point across. And that's a magical moment because you have the opportunity to fix it and assure that or secure that when those labels are in the galleries, in the temporary exhibition, I mean, they will be understood by our public.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Marjorie King from the American Federation of Arts. I have a couple of very quick questions. I hope you'll bear with me. The first is for Robert. You talked about the sad percentages of community that come to museums. Have you seen a rise in your percentages, and if so, what has it been? I know you've only done it for like the first quarter of this year, but your new strategy.
Sure. So it is sad, and I think we would all wish for our arts organizations to be much more vibrant. So in fact, that 8% number is worse than that. If our attendance has remained largely static over the past decade, certainly Dallas's and Dallas-Fort Worth metro area has been growing at a staggering rate. So in fact, we're declining in that overall percentage. We are seeing a considerable uptick in our attendance. It's probably we're still pulling those out. It's, of course, as many of you know, difficult to judge year-over-year attendance based on the timing of exhibition openings and such. But so one great statistic happened over our spring break week, where we tripled year-over-year attendance in that same week the prior year. By and large, we're seeing a doubling to tripling on kind of normal, standard week sort of events. That doesn't mean that the overall attendance is going to be that, though. And I think it would be really foolish to assume that just dropping our admission charge will have that sort of long-term effect. I think we will see a short-term bump. We'll probably return to that static size, and the real change in making that impact on a percentage scale in the community will be if we're successful in building long-term relationships, where we take the number of every week visitors, maybe that number is 1,000 today. If you could double that number of every week visitors, I think that sort of grassroots growth is the long-term solution to attendance percentages. But
Sustainability is an issue because you tried it once before, didn't you, in Dallas, I think, maybe 10, 12 years ago.
The museum was free for most of its history until 2001 when it instituted an admission charge, and then we've just recently returned. But I think that sustained relevance in a community depends on actual relevance, actual personal relevance. So focusing on actual personal relevance more so than the attendance numbers is probably a good idea.
Sorry, you had a follow-up.
Another very quick question for Julian. You referred to the exhibition catalog a couple of times, but didn't go into what's happening with that in the new way that you're working. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
I think, do you mean Jan Ludwig, or I think probably you meant Jan Ludwig? Or Salvador, if it was
I did. I meant Salvador. Excuse me. I'm very sorry.
Sure, no
well, the question is how we deal with the catalog in this work schedule. This is something that we are now trying to solve because in our work schedule, when we work with educators and their entire team, the production of the exhibition catalog is not factored in. And the work schedule is so intense. We have to review so much the interpretation plan that we have to do it during the weekend. So we are really reevaluating all this process with our human resources department, and we are actually dealing with some of these issues. At the moment, what we have to do is just doing the catalog during the weekends, because basically there is no time during the week to work in any other thing than the interpretation. But there is a lot of very good, I mean, one of the good things about the DI is there's a very good understanding between the teams, and the educators understand that, and we are really finding a solution fairly soon.
Have the major responsibility for the catalog, though.
Absolutely, that's the place where the hardcore of the scholarly research has to be presented.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I just had, sorry, my name is Rachel. I'm from DiverseWorks in Houston, Texas. And I just had a couple of questions about some of the strategies that were presented. It's a lot adopting a corporate structure in your, the Dallas Museum of Art, sort of an entrepreneurial structure, and the kind of political candidate structure for a museum. And I wonder now, since this topic is museums and civic responsibility, what does that mean that we're trying to do for society if we're adopting these sort of corporate and political models as interpretive strategies?
So, I mean, the question of what are we trying to do is the correct one. And we'll go back to that Stephen Weil quote, whereby while the museum will set its sights on having a civic function in its community, it really probably matters less about what we think we're trying to achieve versus what our community thinks would be valuable for the organization to provide. So it is, in fact, probably some negotiation in between there where it's not as though the arts organization lacks an advocacy role in that, but that there has to be the mediation between the public demand for benefit and the institutional provision of benefit. And that can be tricky, and I won't pretend that we know exactly what that is. I suggested three roles that I think are there or that are viable. Exactly how each of those three may play out is something that we're trying to discover in a very iterative and experimental approach. So the museum itself has a reason and a mission for being, and the missions vary inside of this room. The way that we accomplish that mission inside of a community is interesting. I think it's interesting that the model appears political, and perhaps I wish that our politics had a little more of the civic-minded approach, and I don't feel like that's necessarily the case, but the museum as a community resource for both aesthetic and cultural appreciation and dialogue, I think, is an area where we could be doing better work.
And when you use that phrase, public demand for benefit, that's an interesting language to me, because it is a sort of political language. It's you know, the expectation that the public has of the museum, and I think sometimes as professionals we don't always deal with that head on, and it seems like that's one of the things you're trying to do at Dallas, is to really heighten that expectation almost for your
It
audience.
is, and it's both discovering what demand currently exists and creating demand where it doesn't yet exist. I think if we rewind the clock, no one knew that they wanted an iPhone before it was presented to us. So I think there are some elements of that where it's not only the services or access that we offer today that are known that are the only possibilities.
Right. We have time for two more. First this side, please.
Hello, I'm Carrie Oliver-Smith from the Harn Museum at the University of Florida, and just wanted to make a little commentary about university museums and outreach in that aspect. One is that it's just very interdisciplinary in terms of so many different, trying to target geography, engineering, nursing, etc. Where one of our objectives is to hit every single department in the university. I must say that it really does emphasize STEM subjects, so engineering and medicine, etc., really have great emphasis, so a lot to do with science. But we are doing like museum nights monthly, and we had 700 people attend engineering, perspective for one evening. But I had one question for you too, is the sort of question of the role of the curator. We have so many different models here. One as curator, as artist, and we're also understanding educator as curator too, and there's all these different tensions. So how do we evaluate also how we take chances, as Holland Cotter was suggesting? How do we function artistically as well in this endeavor? What are the evaluations for not being too cautious?
Jan Ludwig, do you want to have a go at that? I mean, since you're in the midst of planning this show, where, I mean, you have an opportunity, in a sense, to try to grapple with some of these issues.
Well, of course, the best evaluation or outcome of an experiment is total failure. Right? And then you know that you have to do it differently. So I don't know exactly how to answer your question, but of course, museums traditionally are kind of risk averse. And so somebody at the beginning, after Mr. Cotter's talk, mentioned the role of the directors. And indeed, it is necessary, and we are lucky to have that in Minneapolis, to have a director who's willing to take risks and let curators experiment. Yeah. So, yeah, it's a philosophical question almost.
Yeah. Anything else from? No. Yes.
Judy Mann from the St. Louis Art Museum. My question concerns, it's a large one, the primacy of the art object, but to sort of put two prongs to that. One to Rob at Dallas. In the discussion of the need for technology and technological literacy, which all of us recognize a need, how does the primacy of the object and the experience of the object enter that discussion? And to Salvatore, having been and experienced the presentation in Dallas, there is an overwhelming amount of interpretive material there. And do you feel at all that times the object loses out to the interpretation?
So I come from a technology background, but those of you who've worked with me know that I very rarely think that technology is the right first solution. As we talk to visitors, the encounter with the real object is always high on the list of things that are meaningful or important to them. I had an experience in Indianapolis even before I started with the museum, where we developed through our university connections a projected table display. It was quite fancy, and from a technical perspective was a really amazing success. For me personally, though, it was a bit of a disappointment. And to Jan Ludwig, I think, you know, a failure is really illustrative. And to me, it was a disappointment because the experience of the visitor when they were leaving was focused on how did that thing work, not what was, not any sort of content or aesthetic appreciation of the object. I mean, we could talk a long time about the aura of the real object or the primacy of the object, but I think that that's the core resource of our museums, lives in our permanent collection and exhibitions, the chance to have a connection in a philosophical or aesthetic level with an object that has experienced possibly many lives in the past is one that keys sort of that personal relevance. And I don't really know that technology is all that good at helping us derive personal relevance, particularly with objects.
I would say that if I answered your question as a curator, I would say yes. Too much interpretation makes the object lose, you know, its aura, or we don't have the same aesthetic experience when you're in front of them. But we always have the opportunity not to look at the interpretation and not read it. And what is true is when you go into the galleries, the interpretation that we use at the DIA, and there's a lot of it, in the walls and in the gallery floor. What our evaluators are telling us is that that interpretation is really helpful for our visitors. They actually are encouraged to look at the art. I was talking recently with one of our educators, and she wanted to install a really large panel in front of a very important painting. And I sort of wanted to take the panel out, put it in a corner or some else where the object would not be so much offended by it, if I use the word. And I'm talking now as a curator. And, but then we talk with our evaluators, and our evaluators have proven that when our visitors are in front of those huge panels, they call it pull-up panels, they read and then they look up and they look at the object. And they actually engage with it, and whatever is written in the panel helps them understand the object from a personal point of view. So if we are able to do that, I think that's a very good goal, that our visitors really have that experience that we're looking for. As a curator, I don't do it, but are the curators the real audience of the museum? So is the general public who comes and has the visitor experience? That's maybe the larger question.
Right, well, time is up all. Thanks very much for your attention. We're on to the next section.